As the United States continues to suffer from the worst drought to hit the country in 50 years, what does the future have in store for America's farmers? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Kimberly Halkett. The United States is known as the breadbasket of the world, producing food not just for domestic consumption, but for feeding hungry consumers worldwide. However, the worst drought to hit the country in 50 years has devastated crops and hit farmers hard. The drought's already leading to a rise in food prices nationally and across the globe. What's more, scientists are linking the extreme weather to global climate change, and it's suggested farmers will have to brace themselves for more unpredictable weather in the coming years. So beyond the short-term crisis, what is the state of American agriculture? Critics argue big agribusinesses are coming to dominate production and say the interests of small farmers are being marginalized as these big companies spend millions lobbying politicians in Washington. Well, given the challenges of the drought, can America's farmers be counted on to meet the future food needs of the world? Bill Norton is a dairy farmer from Des Moines, and he has been hit hard by the drought.
The family farms are going fast. We've been in a serious situation for several years. Now it's almost like, wow, this is crunch time. How are we going to do this? We look at it as now it's costing us so much just to feed a cow, to keep a cow. You know, we can't afford to keep an average or below average cow. So we're sending more cows to market, to butcher, and cutting down on our herd size and trying to make it go, and probably milk less cows this year, hoping that we can survive. It doesn't pencil out. We're losing money. So how long can we do that? You know, everybody's in their own situation.
So are big agribusinesses too dominant in U.S. agriculture? To discuss this, I'm joined in the studio by Roger Johnson. He's the president of the National Farmers Union. Also with us is Karen Hansen-Kuhn, International Program Director at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. And from Raleigh, North Carolina, Scott Marlowe joins us, Executive Director of the Rural Advancement Foundation International. He represents the interests of small, sustainable farmers. Well, Roger, I want to start with you first. We've got the concern now about the corn production, and we've had the lower yield from the USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture. Concerns all over the globe. Is the U.S. going to be able to meet the world's food needs in the coming year?
Well, the drought, as you know, it's dramatic. It's the worst in over 50 years, and we, for a long time, I'd say in the last 15 or 20 years in this country, have we've moved away from policies that provide more and more carryover stocks. And so as a consequence, when you have a drought that significantly depresses yields, you end up seeing much higher price spikes that are harmful to lots of sectors of the economy and lots of folks, not only in this country but around the world, because you don't have stocks that are able to buffer a lot of those changes. And so we're going to see some pretty dramatic price impacts that are going to play through different pieces of this economy over the next year or two or however long as a result of this.
Well, Karen Hansen-Kuhn, let's pick up on that. I mean, if we're going to see these impacts, who is going to be hardest hit? Is it going to be sort of the larger scale farmer, or is it the small family farm as well that could be affected?
Well, I think if we think about this country and then globally as well, it's consumers as well. I mean, here in this country, they're predicting prices could go at the supermarket, could go up 2 to 4 or 5%. It could be a lot more in developing countries, especially food importing countries. And in a lot of those countries, consumers spend a lot more of their budget on food than they do here. So the impacts could be pretty serious.
Well, we know that of course, Scott Marlowe, you represent the smaller farm and the interest of the smaller farm. Is there a lot of concern right now when it comes to these rising prices in corn, the impacts of the drought, or, I mean, how are they meeting these situations?
Well, we're certainly concerned about farmers like the dairymen that you saw earlier in the segment. A lot of the smaller farmers may not be as eligible for some of our safety net as some of the larger scale and single crop farmers. But we also think that there are some practices and other ways of managing risk through how they produce crops that some of our small-scale farmers have pioneered that have really strong lessons for larger-scale growers and need to be more broadly adopted.
Well, let's talk about some of those. And what are some of the things that the smaller farmer is doing to adapt that maybe isn't applicable in the large-scale farms?
Well, when we work with, the example that I would say is that we worked with a series of smaller scale farmers in a drought that we had here in North Carolina a few years ago, and their losses were quite minimal. And part of that was because by the time they got to late in the season, they had already harvested a significant amount of their crop. They were harvesting things all the way through because of the diversity of crops that they were growing. They were also irrigating, controlling moisture more, but also through soil quality and other pieces, that they're able to do a much more integrated system which spreads out the risk throughout the year instead of it being in one window in the fall, and also provides more natural buffers that instead of having to deal with the problems afterwards and the losses afterwards, help to prevent some of them in the first place.
So Roger, maybe this is one of the arguments that's being made then, that, because America's agriculture has now become, it's concentrated in the hands of fewer businesses, large landowners, that this is what's happening, that there is devastation of drought, and it's affecting not just the U.S., but the world.
Yeah, I think we're mixing a couple of issues here. Obviously, larger scale farmers, I think what Scott says is very true. Many of them tend to become very specialized, and so they tend to grow fewer commodities, and as a result may be somewhat more at risk. On the other side, against that, you've got some new genetics that are helping to make some of those crops a little less susceptible to drought. But on the other hand, you've got a lot of folks that tend to be more diversified in operations. We've seen that decline significantly as crop farming has become more profitable. We've got very good risk management policies in this country, crop insurance in particular, that tends to cover the big commodities, the major commodities, much of which is exported. But many of those policies aren't available for specialty crop producers, and so you don't have this. It's like two different kinds of agriculture that exist.
But still, you said right at the outset that the drought has been devastating,
yes.
will be devastating.
Yes.
Let's look at some of those numbers in terms of the impact, because we do know that among the worst off areas in the United States will be large parts of Nebraska, Kansas, and Missouri, which are among the 11 states that grow more than 80% of U.S. corn. And drought is officially extreme in other parts in the agricultural Midwest, including the states of Iowa and Illinois, which grow more than 30% of U.S. corn. Yes. And at least severe in many other areas. And as you can see in the map that we're showing right there, the drought certainly has affected a wide swath of the United States. So when you have these kind of statistics, we're being told because of climate change that we could see it again, that it could become the norm perhaps, not the exception. Is that enough for the generational farmer to say simply, I've had enough, I can't do this anymore?
Yeah, well, I think you'll find a lot of folks that may very well come to that point. And when they do, what normally happens is you don't have another farmer that steps in behind them. You tend to have other farmers that pick up the guy that quit. And as a result, you see this continued concentration, particularly in the larger commodity areas of the country. And there's an important point that I think that Scott made that we should not overlook here, and that is that while the devastation is mostly against crops and specialty crops, plants as a consequence of the drought, the impact of that financially is less severe for growers of major commodities because we've got very good crop insurance products that are out there protecting them financially. But the downstream impact of that is the market goes sky high, and anyone who's a livestock producer, not only did they lose their pasture, they lose their own feed supplies, but if they're buying feed off of the marketplace, they are now paying 50%, maybe as much as double what they were paying before with very low margins. It's the livestock guys that get hurt by far the worst because they just don't have the same kind of risk management tools. And And the dairy guys, I would argue, are probably suffering more than anyone else in the livestock
And there are going to
industry
have
right
to
now.
be some tough choices made. But I want to get back to some of these issues when it comes to the rising prices. And Karen Hansen-Kuhn, perhaps you could talk a little bit about that. I mean, who ultimately is going to be impacted when it comes to these rising corn prices?
Well, at the international level, I mean, we can think of it a few ways. One, when we have the rising prices and we have the financial markets intervening, so we have speculative markets that tie together food, energy, other commodities, that means that the price increases that have happened here, where we have very high corn prices right now, transmit internationally too. They serve as reference prices, they affect planning in many countries, and so the kinds of things Roger was mentioning with the livestock producers, that's what's happening with food importing countries, Egypt, Pakistan. They're going to have huge import bills. If you have poorer countries, countries that are dependent on food aid, this means they'll have less food aid available. So this is a big problem internationally. I think it does point again, though, to the need to diversify production, and not only within the farm, but internationally as well.
But does it also require policy change, perhaps, too, at the U.S. level? I mean, at this point, it looks like the supply exceeds the demand. No, you're jumping in here. Do you want to jump in here?
I was going to jump in here to come back to something that Roger said, which was the difference in available risk management and safety net programs for the large-scale commodities versus specialty crops and other crops. And what we see is that difference drives the decisions, so that it drives the decision of the banker, which drives the decision of the farmer. And so the types of diversification that we are talking about, and the types of diversification and production-based risk management that we are agreeing is very important with rising storms and disasters and the possibility of even more damage, that is actually made less attractive. It's discouraged by the structure of the disaster assistance programs that we have. And the higher the level of risk management that comes from government programs, the lower the incentive for risk management programs in production, which would mitigate some, not all, but some of the disaster effects.
So does this mean then, let me understand then, you represent sort of the smaller family farm. Does that mean then that really that is where you see the solution being in all of this? That the agribusiness and sort of the dominance of the agribusiness in the United States is really what is causing or compounding the problem?
Well, we work with a fairly wide range of farmers. I've worked with farmers all the way from 4 acres to 12,000 acres. But we do work quite a bit on sustainable agriculture, so that we do work with those who are very creative, often entrepreneurial. And what we see is that that these disaster assistance programs have effects long before the disaster, and obviously through the disaster, where they drive investment, they drive banking, and that drives farm decisions, so that if a farmer wants to diversify, wants to move into more sustainable production, they have a very difficult time doing that because of the access to risk management. And that's especially true for our mid-scale farms. We actually have some growth in very small-scale farms, and we obviously have growth in very large-scale farms.
But how much of a voice is there really for the mid and small-scale farming? And Roger, many people would charge that it's the business that is really dominating the discussion. They have well-placed lobbyists in Washington. They're well-funded, and that's who is really driving this debate.
Well, National Farmers Union represents family farmers and ranchers around the country, and we as a result of that, we tend to represent more of the smaller and the medium-sized farm operators. And I mean, the influence of money in this city is beyond dispute. I mean, it's enormous, it's significant, it is, I mean, it drives a lot of the policies that are in place. We argue as an organization that, you know, we ought to do some more sensible things for humanity. For example, one of the things we promoted was what we call the market-driven inventory system as a part of commodity policy in the Farm Bill this time around, which would incent farmers to hold back production, some of their stored production during low price periods, so that could be made available onto the market during periods just like we're experiencing now, when the market goes crazy because you got supply disruptions as a result of widespread droughts. And as you say, we're likely to see more and more of that if the climate scientists are correct. We need to be thinking about policies that are encouraging sort of fewer of these spikes and troughs and a little more evening out of available supplies.
But how much faith can you have in policy when essentially it sounds like American policy when it comes to agriculture that meets not just domestic needs but the world needs is being bought and sold?
It's difficult to achieve. And as you're right to that very point, our proposal, while we spent a lot of time and energy and a lot of money developing it, really didn't get very far in this Congress. It's not a part of the Farm Bill. It's not likely to be a part of the Farm Bill, but we're going to keep talking about it because it's the right kind of policy that we ought to have, not only nationwide, but for the issues that Karen talks about, for consumers around the world. In the U.S., we as consumers are much less impacted by rising commodity prices because the farmer's share of most of the food we eat is much smaller in the U.S. as opposed to in other countries. And so these impacts are disproportionately impactful, harmful on folks that don't have much money.
And for those that don't know what the Farm Bill is, because outside of the United States, it's not a word that's bandied around a lot.
Sure.
It really is sort of the primary agriculture and food policy tool of the federal government that really not only sort of meets the needs in terms of policy domestically, but even internationally too. So it often is very controversial, and I think that's where a lot of this comes up. And I think when we're talking about policy too, we also need to talk about the ethanol mandate, because I think that's one policy that's certainly, as we're talking about some difficult choices, is one where there are, depending on what side of the argument you're on, some are in favor of getting rid of this mandate that American gasoline have ethanol, which is distilled from corn, contained in it. People are saying now that, you know, we're favoring more the U.S. car than we are the mouths of hungry people around the world. I mean, we should probably take a look at this policy, and we can talk a little bit more about it in detail after that. But essentially, ethanol, which is made from corn, has been increasingly tapped in the United States as a source of fuel. Supporters say it will help reduce dependence on oil imports. And a 2007 law mandated that the use of more ethanol and gasoline occur each year. Now, it does require that 57 billion liters of ethanol should be blended into gasoline for 2015. This year's requirement is 50 billion gallons. This has diverted 40% of the corn harvest to fuel production, even as corn prices have jumped 60% since June. Now, the Obama administration still supports the mandate. The Agriculture Secretary says the ethanol market's already responded to the drought, with production falling after corn prices rose. Well, Karen Hansen-Kuhn, I want to ask you, maybe I'll pick up there.
I want to talk about that too, because I disagree with a lot of the figures that you just used, but go ahead, Karen.
Well, there does seem to be, though, some solid, we may disagree on a percentage point or two, but the fact remains that a large percentage of U.S. corn, though, does in fact go to ethanol production. And there is the argument that that maybe is not the right policy anymore. Is that right, Karen?
It's a complicated issue, as we can see. I mean, I think it's certainly true. When a lot of us got involved in thinking about biofuels, it was when there was overproduction of U.S. corn, and it seemed like a way to absorb excess capacity. Now I think there is reason to think over the long term how we scale that back, how we balance it, not just in the United States, but with Europe and biofuels policies that have been advanced in other countries too, so that we get more of a balance. But I think also, I come back to, when I hear this idea of the U.S. feeds the world. Historically, that's true. To some degree, it's still real. But more and more, but some of that was created. Some of that was financial institutions, donor agencies, telling countries that the best policy was not to worry about growing their own food, but to import it from wherever it was cheapest. So we had, in many countries, production capacity was weakened. So rather than simply accepting that the U.S. feeds the world, we need to be putting a lot more emphasis on building up local production in developing countries. And that's starting to happen. And that could help to balance it to some degree.
So do you think, you know what, and I should jump in here. We do, in fact, have one of those numbers that I did read was incorrect, and it was the one regarding the requirement this year for the ethanol requirement. It's not 50 billion gallons, it's 50 billion liters.
Well, but the real point, first of all, to Karen's point, that she just made, that's something that we can agree with in terms of helping folks along the way. But when we go back to the ethanol issue, there's the big statistic you use that we really object to. First of all, farmers started the ethanol industry, as Karen indicated, when we had a long period of very, very poor prices. Farmers are going broke by scores because they couldn't make money raising corn. Government didn't have the right kind of policies to encourage the right kind of price and supply interactions. And so as a consequence, a lot of farmers got together and tried to figure out how can we add value to the corn. The ethanol industry largely grew as a result of that. But it's not 40% of the corn on a net basis that goes into ethanol today. It's true when you look at the bushels, but in fact, only a third of that bushel of corn actually goes into ethanol. Much of the rest of it is remaining distiller's grains. That's a high quality animal feed and goes right back to feed the animals that the corn would have fed had it not gone into ethanol first. So that piece people really need to understand. Beyond that, though, I think this is an example of having short-sighted policies. We ought to be looking at what's best in the long term. Having more stable prices, having more predictable markets, having more stable production levels that can be supplemented by stored commodities that are set aside during periods of surplus production so they can be available at these periods makes a whole lot more sense and mitigates against much of these issues we've been talking about.
But the other thing I'd say about, and I just need to jump in here though, is that the calls for the mandate to be relaxed, suspended, whatever you'd like to say, are growing in intensity. I mean, we've got the head of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization saying that this is cutting into the world's food supply. I mean, is it?
Well, let me just take a quick response to that, because here's the problem with destroying the mandate today. First of all, let's understand that the mandate is not only about corn ethanol, but it's a lot about advanced biofuels and cellulosic ethanol, which come not from food-grown crops. We are very close to having filled up the corn portion of the ethanol mandate. And you can take the RFS and set it aside today, and it'll have very little impact. It isn't going to grow a whole bunch of corn in the middle of a drought. So it doesn't solve the problem we've got today. What it does is long-term, it sends a signal to the industry, quit trying to do research and development on advanced biofuels and cellulosic ethanol, which is the next generation, and where the real promise of trying to get some reduction in our dependency on foreign sources of oil is.
I want to bring Scott back into the discussion. And Scott, where do you stand on all of this? I mean, you know, it seems though if we've got limited numbers and a big demand, that there are going to have to be some tough choices made when it comes to, I mean, are we talking now rationing of the food stock? I mean, what do we cut first? Do we cut exports, feed? Do we cut, you know, the requirement to going to ethanol? I mean, where do you stand on this?
Well, I want to come back to something that was said earlier about the concentration of production and putting it where it's cheapest. What we've seen that happen over time, it's caused a heavy concentration in agriculture, fewer and fewer companies and fewer farms doing a higher and higher percentage. And that works if you're, you know, in a factory or in a closed system. Agriculture obviously is not a closed system, it's a natural system. And so as we look at increasing storms and increasing problems, we need to be looking at how we decentralize instead of centralize, how we move out and increase diversity rather than decrease diversity. Because part of the problem here is that you have one area that is responsible for such a huge percentage of the food, or the corn. The reason why we're having this conversation is because so much of it is grown in one place. If we begin to look at how we spread food production more, diversify, and build in natural systems and diversity that allow us to address problems more effectively, it can be done efficiently, it can be done effectively, but what we're seeing is that the damage can often overwhelm the economies of scale that benefit in the short term.
All right, Karen Hansen-Kuhn will give you the last word. We're almost out of time.
Well, I just want to pick up on a point Roger raised on reserves, because that is important at the international level too. And I would say we're seeing a lot more traction internationally for that issue than in the United States. You know, 20, 30 years ago, most countries had grain reserves. So when this kind of shortage happened, there was something to fall back on. That's gone for the most part, although I think we're starting to see in West Africa, there are negotiations of regional reserves. China last week announced it was releasing some of its corn and rice reserves. So perhaps that's something we need to be learning from in this country as well.
No easy answers. And that is all from the team here in Washington for now. Now, don't forget to follow us on Twitter and on Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send us your ideas directly to us here at Inside Story at aljazeera.net.